Hi, my name is Debbie Bond, and I just wanted to welcome everyone to today's special event as part of our Take 30 series. This week, this session is our Not If, But When. We've been running these Tuesdays at 11 during the month of June, and we thank Nicole and Maggie for hosting them for us. We also have the Thursday Take 30 series that runs every Thursday at 11. This Thursday, join us, and it's a modern data approach to Cognos analytics. Please, as always, remember to ask any questions in the question box, and we'll save some time at the end for that. And appreciate you joining us. Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Debbie. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our special event. This is our Not If, But When, how to mitigate risk around sensitive data. I am Nicole Payne. I'm a cybersecurity technical specialist for the Americas. And I have a peer of mine, Maggie Zeed, on as well. And we're here to walk through a use case with you all today. So the use case that we're going to be going through today is our risk-based approach. So we're going to go through how you can use the risk that's in your environment to formulate a security approach to lock down those risky and potentially vulnerable data sources. So as we go through this use case, there are some questions that I want you to think about. The first one is going to be, how do you define risk? So risk is going to be different for each and every organization, depending on what type of business you run. So for example, if you're a bank, there might handle financial information, credit cards, social security numbers, and that's sensitive data, and there's a certain risk associated with that. But say you are a bakery, and you have like the best cookies in the whole US, and that cookie recipe is super top secret. And if it were to get out, everyone would make your cookies, and you lose that leg up in your area of business. So you have a certain risk that's associated with that. So for each business, risk is a little bit different. So think about what that means for you. The other thing I want you guys to think about is what causes risk in your environment. So are you a business who has a lot of customer traffic, where customers are interacting with your data through multiple web applications, and there's a risk caused by that? Or are you super locked down, no real outside traffic that causes risk, but you're worried about, insider threat due to, permissions and things of the like? So what causes risk for you? And then once you've kind of thought about what does risk mean for you and what could potentially cause risk for your environment, how would you prioritize that? So you have things that are risky, you have things that cause risk, and how do you go about handling what first? What takes priority, and what can we kind of leave to remediate, not never, but at a later date? So, how do you go about that? And our use case is going to go into how Guardium can help you to prioritize that risk and handle things according to what might be the most important on your checklist of things to do. So just an introduction to our use case. So Roger is our company data custodian. He's in charge of all of our database sets, whether they be sensitive or otherwise. And Roger has a new privacy officer at the company. And this privacy officer wants a little bit more information about the risk associated with these different database sets. So Roger's thinking about how he's going to, provide this privacy officer with an answer. So is he going to simply say, oh, I think this database is sensitive, so that's associated with being risky? Or, is he just going to use a different way to quantify this risk? And Roger remembers, oh, great, my company has Guardium. So I'm able to actually use the tools associated with Guardium to be able to quantify this risk and hopefully provide our privacy officer with the answer that he is looking for. So we are going to head over to our Guardium UI. And log in. And so once Roger is logged in here, he's met with our Guardian Data Protection landing screen. The portions that we're going to focus on today are going to be the classify portion of discover and classify, as well as the assess vulnerabilities portion. So in order to determine risk, we first have to classify that data and assess the vulnerability of it. So we have two types of data. There's data that's associated with being high value. So these are things that are like credit card numbers, social security numbers, any data that's sensitive and should be kept away from, just any wandering eyes. And then we want to think about the vulnerability of that data. So if we have, a low value of data, which is something, maybe readily found on Google, but it's super vulnerable, that's not really as important as if, our social security numbers aren't exactly locked down and there's a large vulnerability there. There's a huge risk associated with that. Multiple unfortunate impacts can happen if there were to be a leakage of that data. So we want to be able to classify, high value versus low value, and then vulnerable or not vulnerable. So in order to do this, what Roger's going to do first is run a classification scan. So Roger has gone ahead and classified the database that's in question, and he's formulated these nice dashboards to be able to review his results. So we're going to go ahead into our classification dashboard. You'll see here on the top left of the screen, we have 3 different databases. We have a DB2, a MySQL, as well as an Oracle database. And the title of this table is Classified PII Data. So this is personally identifiable information. So think of things like names, birthdays, basically anything that can identify one specific person. And when we look at these counts, we will see that DB2 has the highest number of hits on personal data, followed by MySQL, and then Oracle has the least amount. If we look at, the data that we're classifying within these databases, and I will admit, this is just a test environment, so not a super huge amount of data here, but the hits that we were able to get were last name, so we have quite a few of those, and then location. Ideally, in your environment, you would have a lot more data to sort through. So you would have things like last names, again, birthdays, maybe social security numbers if that's something that you collect, phone numbers, things of the like. But this is just a test environment, so for demonstration purposes here, we're looking at last names and locations. So now that we've kind of looked at how we've classified our data, and we've determined, DB2 has the highest amount of sensitive data. We want to dig a little further and see, okay, we have high value data here. Let's assess the vulnerability of this data, because if the data is of high value but isn't vulnerable at all, that's not really something that we need to be paying attention for. So Roger's going to go back and he's going to run another assessment, and this is going to be called our vulnerability assessment. And this will look at things like, database configurations, versioning, permissions, and things of the like to determine how locked down that database is. So we'll go to the results dashboard for our vulnerability assessment. And you'll see here, this is called failed critical tests by the data source types. So essentially, when the vulnerability assessment scan was run, this shows us how many tests that were deemed critical were failed by that database. So DB2 has a fair amount, a little less than 100, MySQL very few, and then Oracle has the highest amount. So just thinking, Oracle has the highest number of failed critical tests, that's most important. I'm going to prioritize Oracle. But if you remember from our classification scan, Oracle had the least amount of personally identifiable information. So even though that database is vulnerable in terms of the scan that we've conducted, there isn't really high value data there. So there's no need for us to really focus our efforts, at least not first off, on trying to lock down that Oracle database. Instead, we want to keep our focus here on DB2, which we know has a high amount of sensitive information, and it also has a fairly decent amount of failed critical tests. If you look here to the right, we can also look at the number of failed tests by severity. So this will tell us if, 14 minor tests were failed, 72 major, and so on and so forth. And the tabular view is really great, but there's a really great feature in Guardium where you can change how you're viewing everything. So if you go here into edit mode, I can actually make this graphical, which is personally just a little easier on my eyes. You can see here just from the height of the bars that we mainly on DB2 failed a lot of critical and major vulnerability tests, which is of decent concern for us. We can also pop over and look at our Oracle failed tests, make this graphical view as well, and see that, critical and major were also of major concern here. And then on MySQL, we have a lot of minor tests failed. So MySQL's probably not something you want to focus too highly on, not too much PII there, and it's fairly secure. So in terms of trying to focus on what we want to provide our privacy officer, we want to say, hey, our riskiest database is most likely going to be DB2. We have a lot of personally identifiable information there that we need to be concerned about, and also a fair number of vulnerabilities. Second on our list would probably be our Oracle database. Not as much sensitive information there, but it does have a fair amount of vulnerabilities that we want to make sure that we remediate for the future. And then MySQL is probably last on our list. We can provide it a little less attention to detail. And our privacy officer is also going to be very thrilled with our in-depth analysis. We can provide him with these charts so that if he doesn't like our answers or just wants to double check, he can draw his own conclusions as well, which is really great about having these dashboards and having this view to be able to make these judgment calls. But let's say, the privacy officer gets back to us, he likes our findings, and he wants us to go back and fix them, obviously. So the first thing we're asking ourselves is, where do we begin? How do we remediate this? And Guardium can go ahead and help you do that as well. So if we go into our vulnerability assessment, which will show us the results from the test that we conducted, we will click here. We want to start with DB2. That was our area of highest concern. So we click view our results, and it will pop up with a nice little report card. So this will say, how well we passed our vulnerability assessment. We did not pass with flying colors, only 24% here. It'll also give a little bit of summary of the results. So it'll break this down on if the vulnerabilities were related to privilege, authentication, configuration, the version, or otherwise. And there's also this really great thing here to the top right, which goes over the assessment result history. So this keeps a history of all of the results of the vulnerability assessments that you run. And this is a test environment, so I'm not exactly going back and remediating these things. But ideally, what you would see is once you've gone in, taken heed of these results, and made the necessary fixes, you would have a positive increase line over time as the security of your database got better and better. So it's also a really nice way to kind of check your progress, maybe set goals and say, hey, we want to get to at least a 60% pass by the end of the next quarter. And just make sure that you're on track to securing your databases and keeping your data safe and secure. You can also go a little further into depth here into your assessment test results. And if you have absolutely no clue where to start, let's say Roger usually isn't the one putting the patches for the databases and trying to secure things, there's very in-depth explanations of the test, the findings, and then recommendations. So we actually provide you with a way on how to, fix these vulnerabilities so that the next time that you, take this test and hopefully pass, you made the correct changes, updated versions, added the fix packs, and things of the like, so that your data is safe and secure, and we're not just giving you, oh, you failed this test, but you don't know how to remediate what you've seen. So that's very beneficial information for Roger. He's able to go back. The privacy officer is pleased with his findings, and we will just review. So what we saw is Roger running a classification scan on all 3 of his databases in order to determine where his company's sensitive data resides. So that's that high value versus low value data, to see kind of what we're looking at and what actually needs protecting and what doesn't. And then we also ran a vulnerability scan on those data sources to see what's most vulnerable. So is it likely that this is going to be victim to attack, or unlikely that this will be victim to attack? And this is just a little input of our findings. So we see here that, our DB2 is the most risky because it has a lot of sensitive data on it in relation to the other 2 databases in question. And it has the most failed tests on the vulnerability scan. And we want to, take heed of that because we have a lot of failed tests and high value data. So one thing that you want to think about is risk can easily be broken down into, an equation. And the equation is, probability times impact. So how likely is something going to happen, and, how terribly is it going to impact my business? So here we'll see our likelihood is, modeled by the vulnerability. So DB2 is, fairly likely that it could be victim to some type of unfortunate attack, unfortunate event, because it is fairly vulnerable. And then times the impact of that data, which we modeled here using our classification process. So that data is, extremely sensitive based on, what's being held in that database. So, when you multiply those 2 together, we get a fairly risky, data set that we want to make sure to remedy and take care of. And that's something that you should use day to day in your business to make sure, hey, I want to, lock down my sensitive data that's the most at risk of attack and prioritize that way, and then work your way down. That way you're remediating with a purpose and, finding what needs to be done in accordance and making your data security journey a lot more efficient. And that is all I had for you all today. I hope you enjoyed the use case. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Yes, as Nicole just said, if you have questions, please put them in the question box. We do have a couple. So Nicole or Maggie, are data classification and vulnerability scans the only things to consider when determining the risk of my data set?
Yeah, so obviously those are 2 important things to consider, but also the data that's in your environment. So it's also important to draw outside conclusions. So while these graphs and tools are very great, you can also add additional insight. So say, for example, it comes back that you have a database that is, super risky because it has a lot of sensitive information in it, and highly vulnerable because it's not exactly patched, but you know that this is a database that's in a test environment, and you made up all this data and it's essentially dummy data, and you're not going to remediate it because it's simply for the purposes of testing new applications. You have that additional insight to say, hey, I know what came back on my scan, but I know based on how I know my environment that this isn't something that I need to pay attention to. So, location of your data, how it's being used, essentially things that the human input would add to the Guardian results can help to draw those additional conclusions. So it's not completely just going off of those 2 test results.
Great, thank you. The next question is is with respect to classification. How is it done, and can I change the way things are classified?
Yeah, so our our classification is done using regular expressions. There's also pattern matching as well as like column name matching. So say you have a database and there's a column name that says, gender. Guardian has the insight to know, hey, this is sensitive information. It's not matched to your regular expression, but I know that this column name will have sensitive data within it. You can also add an audit process at the end if you believe that your classification results are a little different than you'd like. We actually had a customer, for example, that had 9-digit numbers that they were using to label models of items, and the regular expression was reading that as a social security number, but they were able to go back and say, hey, this actually isn't a million social security numbers, these are just item numbers, and they're not as sensitive as they're being labeled to be. So you can go back and kind of edit those just to make sure that your results are right. And you also have the ability to change the regular expressions particular to your business, and also stand for intellectual property. So the bakery cookie example I gave earlier, you can edit the classification process to look for cookie recipe ingredients or things like that. So it's very flexible, and you can easily adjust it to your business.
That's great. Um, can can these tools help my compliance efforts?
Yes, so these tools are actually built to assist with your compliance efforts. You can classify data that might fall into PCI information, payment card, industry, privacy compliance, SOX, GDPR, as well as CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act. And we also have what we call compliance accelerators, which can help to, get that journey started along. And basically, we've just built Guardium to kind of help with your compliance journey, to be able to take some of that guesswork out and get you there a little bit faster. So instead of just wondering, oh, I think I might have, information here relating to California customers, Guardian's able to go in and scan your environment based on a classification we put together using regular expressions, and find that data. And then again, if your business is a little different, the pre-fleshed out classification processes that we built can be changed to adhere to however you all run your business.
Well, thank you for that. And we don't have any more questions. So I think we can close out the session and have people join us next week for the final episode of Not If, But When.
Awesome. Thank you guys all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed what you saw and learned something new.
I just wanted to add one more thing. If anybody, just remember to go to ironsidegroup.com/resources, and you'll see the upcoming webinars. Thanks. Take care.